In January 1972, David Bowie did something no major rock star had done before. He publicly declared his bisexuality in an interview with Melody Maker magazine. The statement, "I'm gay and always have been, even when I was David Jones," was technically inaccurate since he was actually bisexual rather than gay. But it was revolutionary nonetheless. Britain in 1972 was still operating under the shadow of laws that had criminalized homosexuality until just 5 years earlier, and the cultural stigma remained intense. Rock stars were supposed to be aggressively heterosexual, their appeal based on being desirable to women while embodying traditional masculinity. Bowie's declaration shattered these expectations and made him both a hero to LGBTQ fans and a target for conservative criticism. But it also raised questions about his marriage to Angela and about songs like Angie that seemed to be about romantic longing. If Bowie was openly bisexual, if he and Angela both had relationships with people of multiple genders, then who exactly was Angie about? The ambiguity wasn't accidental. Bowie was deliberately creating art that refused easy categorization. Songs that could be heard as straight love songs by mainstream audiences, while carrying different meanings for queer listeners who understood the coded language. Angie became a symbol of this deliberate ambiguity, a song that was simultaneously about a woman, about a man, and about the impossibility of reducing desire to simple categories. If you want to discover the hidden stories behind music's greatest mysteries, subscribe to our channel now. Because the truth about Angie is more complicated than anyone imagined. The interview that changed everything appeared in Melody Maker on January 22, 1972, conducted by journalist Michael Watts. Bowie, then 24 years old and on the verge of breakthrough success with his Ziggy Stardust persona, sat in his manager's office, wearing a woman's dress, and answered questions with a frankness that was almost shocking in its casualness. When Watts asked about his sexuality, Bowie didn't hesitate or deflect. He simply stated that he was gay, that he always had been, and that his marriage to Angela didn't change that fact because she understood and accepted who he was. The article, titled "Oh, You Pretty Thing," sent shockwaves through British popular culture. Television shows debated whether the BBC should continue playing Bowie's music. Conservative politicians condemned him as a corrupting influence on youth. Religious leaders called for boycotts. But among young people, particularly those struggling with their own sexuality in an unaccepting society, the response was different. Bowie became an instant icon, proof that you could be successful, artistic, married, and openly queer, all at the same time. But the interview also created confusion, because Bowie's actual sexuality was more complex than the label gay suggested. He was attracted to both men and women, had been in relationships with both genders, and his marriage to Angela was genuine, even if it was also unconventional. In later years, he would correct the record and identify as bisexual. But in 1972, bisexuality wasn't widely understood as a legitimate identity category. The choice was between gay or straight, and by choosing gay, Bowie was making a statement that rejection of heterosexual norms was more important than precise accuracy about his actual desires. This deliberate ambiguity about identity would become central to understanding songs like Angie, which arrived a year later and seemed to be about lost love, but refused to specify the gender of the person being mourned. Was it about Angela? About a man? About the complexity of loving multiple people in ways that society couldn't categorize or accept? David met Angela Barnett in 1969 at a club in London, and their connection was immediate and intense. Angela, known as Angie, was American, sophisticated, sexually adventurous, and completely uninterested in conventional morality. She had attended a Swiss finishing school, studied in Cyprus, and moved in artistic circles where experimentation with gender, sexuality, and relationships was normalized. When David explained that he was bisexual and had relationships with men, Angie's response was enthusiastic rather than concerned. She was bisexual herself, she explained, and the idea of a traditional monogamous marriage held no appeal for either of them. They married in March 1970 with an explicit agreement that both would be free to pursue other relationships, that jealousy was a bourgeois emotion they would overcome, and that their union was a partnership for artistic and social purposes as much as romantic ones. For David, who was still struggling to establish himself in the music industry, Angie provided connections, ambition, and a kind of fearlessness about challenging social norms that matched his own emerging vision of himself as an artist. The early years of their marriage were characterized by chaos, creativity, and constant boundary pushing. They lived in a small flat in Beckenham, surrounded by musicians, artists, and hangers-on who treated their home as a permanent party space. Angie managed David's early career with aggressive determination, pushing promoters and record labels to give him opportunities. They both had affairs, sometimes separately and sometimes together, navigating the complicated logistics of open marriage before most people even had vocabulary for such arrangements. Angie would later describe this period as exhilarating but exhausting, a time when the theoretical freedom of their arrangement constantly collided with messy human emotions like jealousy and insecurity that their agreement was supposed to eliminate. When David's career finally broke through in 1972 with the creation of Ziggy Stardust, the success brought new complications. Suddenly, there were more opportunities for both of them to pursue other relationships, but also more public scrutiny of their unconventional marriage and more pressure to present a coherent public image. Angie was recorded in December 1972 during sessions for the Aladdin Sane album at Trident Studios in London. The song came together quickly, with Bowie working out the melody on piano and writing lyrics that seemed unusually direct and emotionally vulnerable compared to his typically more theatrical and cryptic compositions. Producer Ken Scott would later describe the recording session as different from the others, quieter and more contemplative, with Bowie seeming genuinely moved by the material he was performing. The song's structure was simple, just piano, strings, and Bowie's voice delivering lyrics about a relationship that had to end, about loving someone but knowing they couldn't be together, about saying goodbye with both regret and acceptance. When the vocal take was finished, there was a moment of silence in the studio before everyone realized they had captured something special, a moment of genuine emotion that transcended the artistic distance Bowie usually maintained. But even during the recording, questions arose about who the song was actually about. The name Angie seemed like an obvious reference to his wife Angela, but the lyrics didn't quite fit their relationship, which was ongoing and showed no signs of ending at that point. The melancholy tone suggested loss and farewell, but David and Angie were still together, still collaborating, still presenting themselves as partners. Some of the musicians in the studio quietly speculated that the song might be about someone else, perhaps a male lover whose identity had to be hidden behind a female name, perhaps someone David had been involved with during one of the periods when he and Angie were pursuing separate relationships. Bowie himself offered no clarification, simply finishing the recording and moving on to other tracks. The ambiguity seemed intentional, as if the song was designed to function on multiple levels, depending on who was listening and what they needed it to mean. One theory about Angie's true subject involves Mick Jagger and the complicated web of relationships, rivalries, and attractions that connected Jagger, Bowie, and Angela in the early 70s. Bowie and Jagger first met in the late 60s and developed a relationship that combined genuine friendship with professional rivalry and, according to persistent rumors, something more intimate. They were seen together constantly at parties, clubs, and social events, always gravitating toward each other. their body language suggesting a chemistry that went beyond ordinary friendship. Angela was also drawn to Jagger, openly admitting her attraction and making no secret of the fact that she found him as fascinating as David did. This created a strange triangle where all three people were attracted to each other in different ways and to different degrees, with the boundaries between friendship, professional admiration, and sexual desire becoming increasingly blurred. The most explosive claim about this triangle came years later in Angela's memoir, where she described walking into her London home one afternoon and finding David and Mick Jagger in bed together. According to her account, she wasn't shocked by the sight because their open marriage meant both of them were free to have other partners. What bothered her was the specific identity of David's partner, the way his obsession with Jagger had crossed from professional rivalry into physical intimacy. Whether this incident actually occurred remains disputed. Bowie never confirmed it. Jagger has denied it. And Angela's version of events has been questioned by those who point out that her memoir was published during a bitter divorce and custody battle with Bowie, giving her motivation to share sensational stories. But the rumors persisted because they fit with observable patterns of behavior, with the undeniable chemistry between Bowie and Jagger, with the way they moved around each other in public spaces, like dancers in an elaborate ritual. Another interpretation of Angie suggests the song isn't about a person at all, but about drug addiction, specifically heroin. In this reading, Angie is slang for the drug, and the lyrics about having to say goodbye and knowing that love brings nothing but misery are about the struggle to overcome addiction. This theory gained traction because Bowie and several members of his circle were experimenting with heroin in the early 70s, before his later cocaine addiction would consume him completely. The song's melancholy tone and sense of inevitable loss could easily describe the relationship between an addict and their drug of choice, the way that something which initially feels like love and comfort eventually becomes a prison that has to be escaped, even though leaving feels impossible. Several musicians who worked with Bowie during this period have suggested that the heroin interpretation makes sense, given the context of what was happening in his life and in his social circle. However, this interpretation has problems. Bowie himself never confirmed it, and the specificity of the name, Angie, seems too precise to be random drug slang. If the song were truly about heroin, why not use more common slang terms that listeners would recognize? The heroin theory feels like a way to deflect from more complicated questions about sexuality and relationships, a more socially acceptable explanation than admitting the song might be about a male lover or about the messy reality of an open marriage. It's worth noting that the heroin interpretation only gained widespread circulation in later years, after Bowie had become more careful about discussing his sexuality in public, suggesting it might have been promoted as a convenient alternative to more truthful but more controversial explanations. Years after their divorce, Angela Bowie spoke more openly about the Angie song and what she believed it was really about. According to her version, the song was written during a period when their open marriage was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The theoretical freedom they had promised each other was colliding with the reality of jealousy, possessiveness, and the fact that David's relationships with men threatened her in ways his relationships with women did not. She felt increasingly sidelined as David's career took off, watching him become Ziggy Stardust and feeling like the person she had married was disappearing into personas and characters and public performance. The song, she suggested, was David's attempt to process his own confusion about whether their marriage could continue, given how much both of them had changed since that optimistic moment in 1970, when they had believed love and honesty could overcome any obstacle. Angela's interpretation suggests the song is actually about her, after all, but not in the simple way most listeners assumed. It wasn't a love song to his wife, but rather a farewell letter, an acknowledgement that their experimental approach to marriage was failing, even though neither of them wanted to admit it yet. The line, "Angie, you can't say we never tried," takes on new meaning in this reading. They had tried to make an open marriage work, tried to overcome jealousy through honesty, tried to support each other's artistic and sexual freedom, and it wasn't enough. The sadness in Bowie's vocal performance was genuine because he was mourning the loss of the idealistic vision they had started with, even as their actual marriage continued for several more years in increasingly hollow form. By the time they finally divorced in 1980, the relationship described in Angie had been dead for years, and the song stood as a document of the moment when both of them knew it, but weren't ready to say it out loud. For LGBTQ listeners in 1973, Angie carried meanings that straight audiences might not catch, but that felt obvious to those who understood coded language. The song arrived just over a year after Bowie's bisexuality declaration, during a period when he was the most prominent, openly queer person in popular music. When he sang about loving someone but having to say goodbye, about people talking and making him feel bad, about wondering where he would be without this person's love. Queer listeners heard a different story than mainstream audiences. They heard a song about same-sex desire in a society that couldn't accept it, about relationships that had to be hidden or ended because the social cost was too high, about the specific pain of loving someone when the world tells you that love is wrong or impossible. The genius of the song's construction was that it worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Straight off for LGBTQ listeners in 1973, Angie carried meanings that audiences could hear it as a conventional breakup song, sad but ultimately comprehensible within familiar emotional territory. Queer audiences could hear the coded language they recognized from their own lives, the ways they had learned to talk about same-sex relationships in public without naming them explicitly. And Bowie himself maintained the ambiguity deliberately, refusing to confirm or deny various interpretations, allowing the song to mean different things to different listeners. This wasn't dishonesty so much as recognition that identity and desire are complicated, that a song about love and loss could be true on multiple levels simultaneously, that the question, "Is this about a man or a woman?" might be less important than the emotional truth of the experience being described. Whatever the true inspiration, Angie became David Bowie's first major American hit when it was released as a single in 1973. The song reached number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, far higher than anything he had achieved previously, and it introduced him to millions of American listeners who knew nothing about his Ziggy Stardust persona or his declarations of bisexuality. For many Americans, Angie was simply a beautiful, sad song about lost love, played on the radio alongside other pop hits, with no awareness of the complicated stories and controversies surrounding it in Britain. This created a strange split in Bowie's audience, with British fans who knew his full story and American fans who were just discovering him through what seemed like a conventional love ballad. The song's commercial success also created pressure for Bowie to repeat that formula, to write more accessible material rather than the experimental art rock he was increasingly drawn to, leading to creative tensions that would shape his work for years to come. The success of Angie also intensified scrutiny of Bowie's personal life and marriage. Journalists constantly asked him about the song's meaning, about whether his marriage to Angela was real or just another performance like his stage personas, about whether his bisexuality was genuine or a publicity stunt. Bowie responded to these questions with varying levels of honesty, depending on his mood and the context, sometimes embracing the controversy, and sometimes deflecting with jokes or deliberate misdirection. Angela became a reluctant public figure, expected to comment on her husband's sexuality and their unconventional marriage arrangement in interviews that often felt more like interrogations. The attention was flattering at first, but quickly became exhausting, particularly as their relationship continued to deteriorate under the pressure of fame, drug use, and the gap between their theoretical ideals about open marriage and the messy reality of their actual feelings. The release of Angie coincided with the peak of Bowie's Ziggy Stardust era, a period when he was performing as an androgynous alien rock star who embodied sexual ambiguity and gender fluidity. Ziggy was supposed to be bisexual, open about his desires, unashamed of his difference from conventional masculine norms. The character allowed Bowie to explore themes of sexuality and identity in theatrical form, creating distance between himself and the controversial statements he was making through Ziggy's persona. But the lines between Bowie and Ziggy blurred quickly, with audiences and media often treating them as the same person. When Ziggy talked about loving both men and women, was that Bowie's voice or the character's? When Angie played during Ziggy concerts, who was the song about in that context? The ambiguity was productive artistically, but increasingly confusing personally, as Bowie struggled to maintain any separation between his public performance and his private life. Angela's role during the Ziggy era was complicated and often contradictory. She helped create the look and feel of the character, contributing ideas about costumes and staging that became central to Ziggy's visual impact. But she also found herself competing with the character for her husband's attention and identity, watching David disappear into Ziggy in ways that made normal marital communication difficult. When Angie was performed during concerts, she had to watch thousands of people respond to a song that might be about her, might be about someone else, might be about the dissolution of their marriage, all while maintaining the public image of the supportive wife who embraced her husband's boundary-breaking artistry. The emotional cost was significant, contributing to increased drinking and drug use, and to the deterioration of whatever foundation their relationship had once possessed. 50 years after its release, the question of who or what Angie is really about remains unresolved. Bowie took the full truth to his grave in 2016, having given so many contradictory explanations over the years that establishing any single authoritative version became impossible. In some interviews, he suggested it was about his wife. In others, he implied it was about a male lover whose identity he would never reveal. Still other times, he claimed it was about drug addiction or simply a fictional construction with no real-world inspiration. The most likely answer is that the song contains elements of multiple truths, that it was about Angela and about other relationships and about the complexity of maintaining honesty in an open marriage and about the specific challenges of being openly bisexual in 1970s Britain. The song worked because it captured genuine emotion without being too specific about its source, allowing listeners to project their own experiences of loss and longing onto a framework that was deliberately left open to interpretation. The mystery itself became part of the song's appeal and its lasting cultural significance. Angie isn't just a beautiful ballad about lost love. It's a document of a specific moment when questions about sexuality, gender, and relationships were being raised in mainstream culture for the first time. It represents the beginning of a conversation about how we understand desire and identity that continues to this day. And it stands as evidence of David Bowie's genius for creating art that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. That means different things to different audiences, that refuses easy categorization or simple explanations. Whether Angie was a woman, a man, or both, whether it was about his wife or his lover or his drug or his art, the song remains powerful because it captures something true about the experience of loving someone in a world that doesn't always allow that love to exist openly. The ambiguity isn't a flaw or an evasion, it's the whole point.